What's up, guys? This is Mark, and welcome to our April devlog for patrons over out on Patreon. This will be out a month later for the rest of you guys out on YouTube. And as you saw in the couple intro shots, we're talking about all things Ponderosa and level design this month. Joining me today is Tom, the developer that's actually been creating our levels and doing our level design. Welcome, Tom.
Hello.
So today we have a couple questions that we know that we wanted to share with you guys what our thought process was. And then as well, we did a community post on our Patreon for our patrons, asking them what questions they had about level design. And we're going to go through and answer a handful of those at the end as well. So to kick it right off, Tom, how are the map locations actually chosen for Century Esteem?
So all of our map locations are chosen as a group. We do a lot of, methodical consideration, weighing one or the other, but we choose them on a mix of, what's a narrow gauge hotspot, what gives good regional representation, what gives good biome diversity. The main goal is for each map to have a unique feel and a unique operational goal. So that allows for making something that will feel close to home for as many people in our US player base as we can. The goal is that no matter where you live in the United States, there will be at least one map that looks a little bit like your backyard, so it feels familiar.
We've shown off a lot with the Ponderosa map. What are the real-world inspirations behind Ponderosa?
So Ponderosa is primarily based on Lake Tahoe and the eastern Sierra Nevada mountain range. The Lake Tahoe Railway and Transportation Company is the most apparent and direct influence, as made apparent with the wharf, the dam, the Tahoe Tavern, which is going to be coming soon. It's currently under development, and a lot of other features that are directly from the Tahoe to Truckee area. But it's not the only inspiration. We're also pulling influence from things like the Sierra Nevada Wood and Lumber Company, the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming, which is where Glenbrook and Tahoe, the two 820D locomotives that were featured in the intro shots, used to run before they were shipped across the lake to Tahoe City. And then we're also looking at pulling inspiration from Westside Lumber Company, Diamond and Caldor, Toll Brothers Lumber Company, and we're mixing those in to flesh out our playable area and provide a bit more variety and density for alternate routes on the map. We're often asked whether we, are going to do one-to-one locations or real locations but scaled down, or fully freelance locations inspired by a general place loosely, and our approach is somewhere in between with the right blend of those. There are, again, direct callouts and parallels to exact locations, but there's other places where we do selective compression or sometimes selective expansion to make a bit more room for yards, or modification for the sake of fitting things together the way we want to emphasize it. And being able to adjust and interpret those locations lets us really play with scale and keep the local feeling large while the macro scale is compressed for gameplay.
Yeah, as much fun as it would be to recreate a location one-to-one, truly, when you're going to have the power to lay your own track, a lot of times you would just end up doing the exact thing that the railroad did, and that's not letting you use your creativity. So doing a selective blend, I think, is going to be a really good way to provide a lot of gameplay versatility and replay value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. We want this to respect the player's time and to be an enjoyable experience, but also a somewhat condensed one for the sake of pacing.
So what kind of industries can we expect to see within the Ponderosa region?
So this is really one of the first times we're starting to talk about industries directly, and I guess the first thing to start with is, yes, there will be industries that you interact with in order to exchange commodities, and you'll have a purpose for running your trains, not just between towns, but industries as well. As you saw in the intro shots, we have a direct wharf connection in Emerald, which is our version of Tahoe City, on our version of Lake Tahoe, which is Emerald Lake. And there's also a standard gauge interchange at Ponderosa, which is our version of Truckee. And these serve as the two main feeders for off-map interchange, and the main line for tourism, which actually served this location between Truckee and Tahoe Tavern. It ran between these 2 points. And so that gives you a good sense of linearity and directionality on the north-south run on the west end. But on the east end, there's also going to be logging based on a large sawmill akin to either Tuolumne or Hobart Mills, with those as inspiration. There will be logging camps, log landings. In addition, there was the Boca Brewery in the area, and additionally creameries, some dairy farms, a couple of meat packing plants, some lumber yards, and also finishing mills like a box factory, a cooperage plant, and a door factory, I believe, in Truckee as well. So there will be a lot of opportunities for vertical integration of the entire timber industry from the hills to the mills.
So everyone, of course, always wants to know, what is the scope and how big is the map? Just how much time are we going to get to spend running trains from place to place?
So Ponderosa is our first but also smallest map, in that it is just over 24 square kilometers of playable area in a shape slightly bigger than a 6 by 4 kilometer rectangle. And we're denoting playable area as somewhere your character can stand, lay track upon, and run a train. The environment around it is much bigger, and we take a lot of time to blend it so that it looks like it is a natural environment extending past what you can play in, just so you don't feel boxed in, like, to not be reminded that it is an enclosed space in a video game. But in that 24 square kilometer area, we're looking at about an hour round trip, including time to turn and service the trains at each end. And that's at track speeds you can expect for an 820D locomotive with about 6 cars. Our largest map in plan is roughly twice that size in playable area. And all maps that we're planning, we want to give emphasis to mainline running with occasional branches rather than just a spider web of industry spurs. This also allows for the main line to give really a sense of directional purpose to running the railroad. You feel like you're not just going to a bunch of sidings, but you have, you're going places. You're moving from one place to another. The scenery changes, the environment and the towns change. It helps sell the sense that the world is somewhere that is interesting to travel through. And as aforementioned, we're going for slightly smaller maps than you might expect, mainly because our goals are a tighter focus and good pacing for dense gameplay. Especially in single player, we don't want the maps to be so big that it becomes overwhelming for a single person. Multiplayer for us is focusing on giving more roles that you can do on a limited number of trains. So instead of just running single player with fireman assist, you could have someone running, someone firing, someone as conductor, someone as brakeman, and it'll give you a lot more to do in a group together in multiplayer. But that said, to put things into perspective, if you look at our largest map in plan and scale it down to an HON3 scale layout, it would be like a model railroad the size of a football field, including end zones. So I really do hope that people understand these are still a good chunk of terrain and that we can make it believable, full, and conducive to players having a really unique and immersive experience in it.
Right. And of course, when we talk about times between directions of the map, like that is just highballing across the map without stopping for anything, not doing any pickups, setouts, not taking water, and that's assuming you've laid perhaps the most ideal route. You may choose to do what might seem like a quicker route, more direct route, and have to battle the grade and slog it out at a slower speed, and your results may vary. But of course, the whole point of the game is moving cargo and getting things going too. So as soon as you add in stops and all that stuff, you can get a play session in. And if you're just doing, I've got a quick hour to play a game before I've got the next thing that's going on in my busy life, you'll be able to get something done. But if you've got the time for a longer binge session, you can get more stuff done. So we're trying to, adhere to both of those different types of players and make sure that they can both get something value about it. Because definitely in the case of something where it takes you 6 hours to get across the railroad, well, that's not conducive for many players. So we're hoping that we can right size it for everybody.
Exactly, to meet the players where they're at and respect their time, whatever that may be.
So what physically actually goes into making a map for Century of Steam, other than, of course, sacrificing interns?
There is a lot that goes into making these environments. The best bet is to lay a foundation, start with a good plan and a lot of research. What we do when we approach a new map design or concept is we start by mapping out what goals do we want to serve, what do we want running the trains to serve in terms of the narrative we want to tell and the type of feel we want people to have experiencing this region. And then from there we map out industry traffic, localization of operational hotspots. And then once you start actually making it, the first rule we have is nothing out of the box. Something that we are very careful to avoid as a team making a historical product is to avoid stuff that markets itself around the Wild West, because it often takes the appearance of Hollywood backlot sets or a sort of Red Dead Redemption kind of spaghetti Western aesthetic, which doesn't really match up well with the architecture of the time period that we see in prototype photos. So we research and replicate what we can to sell the era and region, including map-specific structures like the Tahoe Wharf and the Tahoe Dam that you saw in the intro. And having those landmarks from real places really helps to sell the location. And in addition, the running joke of pine cone shenanigans and arguing about size of pine cones, that stems from our work on custom foliage assets for the game as well. And we're putting a lot of care into replicating the flora of the Tahoe region. As aforementioned, Ponderosa pines were a big one. We're also working on Jeffrey pines, sugar pines, potentially loblollies as well. And if you live in the western U.S., you can immediately tell the difference in shape between eastern and western pines. And that's something we really take a lot of pride and care in showing to help sell the region. We also take special consideration for the flow of water. And the reason for that is it's not just more realistic and plausible to have natural looking rivers and lakes, but railroads often use rivers as ramps. They follow the rivers in order to gain or lose elevation because that's often the flattest thing in a mountainous area. And if you don't get the water right, it's going to really suffer in a game where you have to lay track for your railroads. And so we take a lot of care to make sure that rivers are something that you can follow, and they sort of serve as guides for new players. The general rule is if you follow the river, that should take you where you need to go.
Right, absolutely. Sometimes surveying, sometimes going through height charts and figuring out gradients and doing the math and all that stuff can be quite challenging, but nature has kind of done that for you, at least to begin with. So you at least know, hey, it's probably not a terribly bad idea to follow this. It'll probably work out well enough.
I guess one other consideration for that is, since this is a game where the focus is on you not just running your railroad, but also planning it out and surveying it, we make special considerations so that the map has more options that players can intuit and use for their railroads. Because if we just used one-to-one terrain data, usually the one railroad that was built through a region was the one most sensible route where it made sense to build it. But if you make the terrain in a certain way that allows for more options to be easily found and allows for explicit balancing between maybe something has shallower grades but it's a longer route, or it requires sharper curves, versus something might be more direct but you have a steeper hill to climb or you need to punch a tunnel, that extra cost or operational cost can offset the other routes. You could also incentivize people with more resources in a more difficult to reach area. And so those kind of considerations really help to give a lot of variety and potential in how you build your maps.
What do you most often consider when you're trying to make a map realistic?
A big part of that comes down to members of our team actually living in or visiting some of these locations. And having that in-person reference adds additional insight on how to evoke not just the look of a place, but the feeling of it too. If, say, for example, we wanted to make somewhere like Alaska, it's a green, snowy forest. Yes, you can see that in images online, but it's so vastly different from other green, snowy forested areas. We couldn't do it justice if we just made a flat plain, boxed in on four sides by mountains, threw in a tree that isn't of the region and foliage and rocks that aren't of the region. And, that ignores a lot of the specific character of Alaska, the really steep, angular, sort of Bob Ross style mountains, the valleys with jagged, triangular points carved deep by glaciers, the fjords that form these gateways for giant ore docks leading to the ocean. And understanding that and understanding the feel of Alaskan railroads is so important for something like that. And we try to capture the same with people we know in the Tahoe region or the Sierra Nevadas, as far as capturing the feeling here through, specific vignettes of scenery and imagery and the feeling of the location. A good example would be if you've seen Denis Villeneuve's current Dune saga. It's a great case study for environmental artists. He does a very good job of creating what's called verisimilitude, or as Dan Olson would say, the plausible simulation of reality. And that plausibility and appreciation for this precise imagery in nature is where we can find a lot of the beauty and the ethos in our environments of saying, this is a love letter to Tahoe, or this is a love letter to Colorado, or any places we're looking at. It's important to us not just to have trains that look good and fantastic, and we're very proud of what our 3D modelers are able to do with them, but we want to give them a good background so that they can shine even brighter.
Yeah, railroading is entirely about stories and the human connection. Like, that is the altruism that you'll find all throughout history when you hear about stories from the 1800s, 1900s, what people experienced. And the environment is such a huge touchstone with that. When you're railroading in Colorado versus railroading in the Sierras versus railroading in Alaska, every little piece of it is so different and changes the way that you operate, and it changes the stories that the people experienced. And our goal is to make sure that you get enough of that vibe of that region when you're making new stories with your friends by playing and enjoying this game and having shenanigans that unfold on the railroad. We want to make sure that it is thematically appropriate for everything that's going in those spaces. And so getting the environments just right and making it able to tell that story, it was very, very important. So I'm glad glad it's getting realistic. So everyone is excited about Ponderosa, of course, but we always get questions about other maps. So what else is coming next?
So after Ponderosa, and I should probably clarify this, we did not intentionally name it after the TV show, but it is a very funny coincidence. So we just kind of rolled with it. But after Ponderosa, the locations we're looking at on our radar are something Intermountain themed, something high desert themed, and something Appalachian. So we feel that these 4 biomes are going to offer a really good mix of diversity in both traffic and scenery. And with these, we can also pull from a lot more historic routes like we did with Ponderosa to make a combined experience of them that is unique and captures all those different flavors in a condensed spot.
All right, well, that's going to sum it up for everything that we had that we wanted to share with you directly. But of course, as we mentioned earlier, our patrons over on Patreon got to ask some questions about level design and the way that the maps work out. So we're going to get into our patron Q&A portion here. So first, we have a question from the Undead Hooligan. Is there any possibility for randomly generated worlds? And as well as that, will we be able to have railroads that span across states? And the last thing I'd like to know is, will we be able to build railroads in places that historically didn't have railroads? I know I haven't been commenting much anymore, so props to you guys and everything you've been able to accomplish. I can't wait to throw my money at y'all as soon as the game's released. Keep doing what you're doing, y'all. We appreciate the well wishes, and I think I'll let Tom answer this one.
So as far as procedural generation, any procedurally or randomly generated worlds don't really work for our model, and it also just doesn't really work for the really strict grade and curvature requirements that realistically operating locomotives need. That sort of randomized generation doesn't take into account things like erosion or floodplains or drainage, which are really important not just for the appearance, but as we said with trying to think like water, you need that water to behave right in order to have those ramps for the railroad to follow. And so for that reason, we handcraft all of our environments specifically to enhance the gameplay. As for building railroads in places that historically didn't have them, as aforementioned, we will be focusing on places that did have railroads. It doesn't necessarily need to be a bunch in one place. It might just be one single prototype, but we will then expand it with influence from others in order to create something that appeals to as many people as we can.
From Max Roll, we saw a ship moving earlier. Will any of the historic vessels we know be included in the game? Maybe you could talk to the people at Ocean Liner Designs about some models that you could add.
So we do have 2 historic vessels currently in game. The large one you saw in the trailer and in the background of some of the shots was the SS City of Seattle. And the one more relevant to Ponderosa and Lake Tahoe is the SS Tahoe, which you saw at the dock. And we do have additional ships planned. The SS Meteor was another famous one in the Tahoe region that for a brief time was the fastest ship in the world, as it turns out. And it was just a little tiny lakeboat steamer. But regarding Ocean Liner Design's Grand Voyage, it is definitely another incredible game that folks who are interested in Century of Steam should check out and support. It's doing very beautiful, awesome things to showcase the grandeur of oceanic travel with the historic focus. So please definitely give Mike Brady and that team a follow, because it's really good stuff.
Yep. Shout out to our friend Mike Brady. We love his stuff too. From One Lego Train, are the rails fixed or can the rails be built?
A mix of both, really. We've mentioned in prior videos that we want to offer, for people who want to lay track, the ability to do so, and to also offer people who just want to get in and run trains the option to have fully pre-built track where you can just get in, do the operations and the scenario and campaign side of gameplay, but you'll still be able to modify the track if you want to change it that way. That said, in track laying mode, there are still a couple locations that will need permanent track, such as interchange points. So, obviously you don't want to delete the wharf where the ships have to come in, otherwise where are they going to dock,
From Wide Brim Wizard, will laying track allow us to dig/move the ground in dirt or build tunnels? I know it's likely a programming nightmare, but I would make track laying good and even grades and lines much easier and smoother, even if it's only up to a certain amount of landscape displacement.
So, in short, absolutely. I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it already, to please watch the National Narrow Gauge Convention demo. Track laying and terrain manipulation are one of our most complicated systems, and so there's a lot of edge cases and UI and UX considerations before we can really show it off in full. But what you see in the Narrow Gauge Convention demo is the result of that dynamic terrain system. Our tunnels and shallow cuts and even some fill are created at the beginning of runtime, and that's just how it works. Like we said, more on that later. There's still a bit more that we got to do before we can show that fully.
From Gigi, question, will there be any kind of maintenance system for infrastructure? For example, an unmaintained bridge will sooner or later collapse. Anyways, thanks for the great job. And similar question in the same vein, from Andy Sapp, when it rains and we have a stretch of track with a high ballast fill and it rains, can the rain collect in a puddle and make the track wash out, making a reason for us to make a good short bridge?
So physically destroying the track, either by an act of God or a lack of maintenance, is not something within our planned scope. We just feel that it would not be fun in the long term, and it would be a point of frustration more than interesting gameplay. What's interesting is if you look at early Roller Coaster Tycoon development photos, they show pieces of track being destroyed in coaster crashes, but they removed it before the final game, and that was likely a smart move, mostly just because having to remember the exact alignment a coaster was in and then trying to replicate it from memory when you're focusing so much mental energy on the rest of management of your park, it really just kind of is a point of frustration rather than fun. So we will be leaving out things like bridge collapses or washouts.
And on the subject of maintenance for infrastructure and tracks and all that sort of thing, it's something that we have planned as an optional thing, because sometimes when you get quite the dense rail network, truly maintaining all of it in the proper way tends to be quite the chore, and it may not be everybody's cup of tea. So that's going to be one of our difficulty settings, and more on that when we get down into track laying and maintenance and those sorts of things. From Matt, how will off-map trading occur, e.g. a standard gauge interchange, or is every industry tree going to be entirely based on the game map?
So there were a lot of industry questions, and we tried to get as many as we could for the Q&A. Any industry will require at least some connection to an interchange for some part of its supply chain. Most railroads are not operating in a bubble, and very few operate in a place where every single thing that we would need can come from a small area. So we really feel that having those off-map connections is going to help the world feel bigger and not feel as cluttered. Like, you wouldn't necessarily see a coal mine or a giant oil refinery in Tahoe, mostly because there was no coal or oil there. Glenbrook, until the end of its service life, burned wood. And we also want industries to function in some capacity before the railroads get there. And for every industry to offer something to the railroad, regardless of how much the supply chain is connected. Railroad Tycoon 3 captures this pretty well with simulating river and wagon road traffic and allowing goods to move autonomously around the map before the railroad gets there. And we would like to do something similar for this game as well.
From Biggie Swan, for the industries, will they be pre-placed per map, or can the player place/found their own industries for, e.g., an extra difficult hardcore map?
So for now, industries are pre-placed, especially the larger ones that need a lot of area and hand placement to look right. But with the option for railroads to become involved in industry management. So it's not just going to be a static thing that you transact from and then never consider. It's something that if you want to manage it more directly by purchasing it and expanding the operations with upgraded facilities, you'll be able to. So it's going to be more hands-on of managing and expanding what is there rather than making new things from a virgin landscape.
From One Lego Train, in an environment, how do you decide where to put the industries? Also, are the industries grouped together in locals, or are they single and spread out?
So a lot of our industry placement for what's planned in our maps is driven largely by prototype influence and historic practice and placement. So, for example, our sawmill is in a lower valley in roughly the same areas where the Hobart Mills sawmill is, except we have mirrored it across the Truckee River onto our playable area. But that also allows still the sawmill to be in a lower valley and the log landings and log camps to be up in the hills behind it, so that you still get the benefit of running empties uphill, loads downhill, which will give, more capacity and also more of a challenge trying to control that downhill run. As for whether things are more condensed or more spread out, it also largely depends on the historic precedent and the gameplay considerations for each map. We understand some folks do really like switching and local services, and some prefer longer runs, and we're aiming to make a gameplay loop where players can get a bit of both depending on how they want to do it.
All right, apologies on the pronunciation in advance, but I think it's Theo Halil asks, will you guys be working on simulating rough track work? It seems that it's a huge part of the character of the narrow gauge that the track became full of bumps, dips, and rolls over time, with excessive speed increasing the risk of putting the train in the dirt.
So we are definitely still working on getting the feeling of riding the trains just right, and a lot of that is being done in the current work in the relation between train and track, because that's an ongoing developmental thing. But there is also kind of this myth that narrow gauge was only ever used in mountains or had unballasted, really rough track or steep grades. But what we're hoping with this project is to show the other side of that, where a lot of narrow gauge, just like standard gauge, aims for shallow grades, broad curves, and really the best standards it can. The main reason to build narrow gauge was not necessarily because you didn't have to maintain it as much, but because it was just a lower investment in construction cost, which does often help in mountainous regions. But when you look at something like the South Pacific Coast Railroad's right-of-way, it is extremely impressive and was genuinely built to a high standard and full standard gauge quality. So that's another element that, if you want to make sort of a more rough and tumble railroad, you can, but we also want to give people the ability to build a high quality, fast line.
Yeah, that's definitely something that's a preservation era mentality, because a lot of the stuff at the very end, when folks who are still around had a touchstone with the narrow gauge, they saw a narrow gauge that was beat to death, clapped out, and kind of forgotten about, and had been abandoned multiple times over and was in a state of disrepair. And we're trying to simulate the whole gamut of having everything across the history. And in their heyday, these roads were excellent. There was a hilarious thread from some preservationists talking about timetabled speeds on the Rio Grande and how quickly you could run between Chama and Antonito on the Cumbres and Toltec historically. And when somebody pulled out a historic timetable, everyone was flabbergasted at how fast the trains were actually scheduled to run across the railroad, because it is significantly faster than they run today, and the track's in relatively good shape today. So, it really was built to a good standard, and we want to interpret that the best way we can.
Yeah, there is a certain excitement and adrenaline rush of running these trains as fast as you can possibly do it. It is genuinely a thrilling experience, and we can't wait to be able to share that.
From That Crazy Ass Skunk Guy, what is the approach to designing a map that is open and something players can so easily explore, and imbuing it with story elements that mesh well with the sandbox of the game? What kind of map elements might tell a story to players, especially with the game's goal of making narrow gauge history accessible to newcomers?
Ooh, this is an interesting one, and this is one that I wanted to do last because it is such an interesting question to answer. As for exploration, there's no hard limits on where players can move physically within the playable area, and things like our flyover cam can really help immensely with getting a bird's eye view of the lay of the land for track laying. But as for environmental storytelling, we try to design maps specifically to set players up for the same challenges that real railroads in those regions would have faced. So it almost becomes like a living history lesson of what it would have been like to be there, but with the benefit of designing the world to have not just more options for how to punch through a mountain or other river valleys, but by making it somewhere new, you can't just copy the original route. You have to think for yourself a bit and will have the same experience of this is new terrain and you have to find the first way through. So that'll be a really exciting and fun part of making new locations. And in addition, say on a Colorado-inspired map, if you want to tell the story of narrow gauge development in that state, the progression of environments would start in the east and move west. And so early gameplay, you would start in low open plains, maybe around the Denver or Pueblo area. But as you expand west, you'll find larger and larger mountain ranges until you have to cross something akin to the Continental Divide. And that'll require helper service on each end and a lot of unique operations. And then after that, there's even further steep climbs up to the mining territories. And so that progression of increasingly harsher environments not only lets players partake in that history of Colorado railroading, expanding from Denver to the rich silver and gold fields up in the San Juan Mountains and other places, but it also offers a really good difficulty curve. And being able to have full control over exactly what game and story experience people have, I think is going to lead to a really cool living history lesson in addition to a fun game.
You're going to have to be able to solve the same problems that the railroad did, and you may find by trial and error, just like some of the railroads did, that perhaps your solution wasn't the right one, and along the way you can kind of learn and see how the prototypes did it too. So it's going to be really exciting to get to that point in things here. Anyways, Tom, thank you so much for joining me on this, and everyone, thank you so much for watching. We hope you liked learning a little bit more about Ponderosa, seeing a little bit more of the map itself, seeing kind of our mentality behind level design, and then of course the lovely patron Q&A going through all sorts of things about maps, level design, and what our thought process are. So we're excited to share more with you guys coming forward in the future. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you all next time.